Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Noah from the Marion Library Service, and welcome to our Library Through the Lens live webinar, part of our series of adult programs delivered differently. This evening, thanks to Fremantle Press, we welcome award-winning author, member for Armidale in the Parliament of Western Australia and lecturer in law, Dr Antonio Buti. Tony has written books, articles and other publications on the stolen generations, British child migrants, human rights and sports law. He has also co-produced and co-directed a documentary on racial vilification in sport. Please feel free at any time during the presentation to type any questions you have for Tony into the chat feed on your screen, and I'll ask these at the end of his talk. Now sit back, please grab a cup or glass of wine and welcome Tony.
Hi, thanks very much, Tracy, and thank you for everyone that's joined this event. Obviously, the wonders of technology. I'm in Perth, and you're in Adelaide. So thank you for having some interest in the topic tonight, which is, of course, based on my book, A Stolen Life, the Bruce Trevorrow case, which, of course, was a legal case that was decided in the Supreme Court of South Australia. So before I get on to the story, I probably should give you some background as to why I wrote the book and my experience. Tracy gave you a bit of an introduction of my bio, but really my interest in matters in regards to stolen generations came about through working as a human rights solicitor at the Aboriginal Legal Service of Western Australia in the mid-1990s. And if you remember, those that are in the audience that are old enough to remember, that was a period of time when there was a lot of interest in the issue, and there was a national inquiry into the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, which was instigated by the Keating Labor government of the time, and the subsequent report was bringing them home, which by the time the report was tabled in Parliament, there had been a change of government. The Keating government had been ousted out by the Howard government in 2006. And then, 1996. And as a result, the tabling report occurred under the direction of the Howard government, who never really supported the inquiry and were reasonably hostile to the Bringing Them Home report. At the same time, there was litigation that was occurring. There had been High Court cases, there had also been Federal Court cases, and a couple state jurisdictional cases. All had been unsuccessful because it was quite difficult to try and litigate in an area that was which had occurred some decades previously to the time. So there was issues of historical recollection, historical fact, and also just the legal issues made it very difficult to be successful. So I had a great interest, obviously, because I ran the Stolen Generation Project at the Aboriginal Legal Service. And then when I went into academia on a full-time basis in 1997, I continued in my research in the area and also did my PhD on stolen generation and guardianship law. Then I heard about this decision, the Bruce Trevorrow case, and of course I became quite interested. I wrote an academic article that appeared in the Melbourne University Law Review, and then I thought that I wanted this story to get out to a wider audience, so that set me on the path of writing the book that was published last year, known as A Stolen Life, the Bruce Trevorrow case. So Bruce Trevorrow was born in 1956, November 1956, in the Meningie area of South Australia, and he lived on a camp which was. His parents moved between 1 mile and 3 mile camp away from the town. His parents, for a brief period of time in 1957, around November 1957, split, and Bruce's mother, Thora, left Bruce with his father, Joe, and also 3 siblings. Now, from all accounts, all the native welfare files and so forth was that while the conditions at the camp were reasonably primitive, they always were considered to be of a reasonable standard, and the children were not neglected. The older children were going to school and so forth. But on Christmas Day, 1957, Bruce, who at that stage, as I said, was being looked after by his father, was crying. He seemed to have stomach pains, and Bruce's dad didn't know what to do with him. So he walked into the town, into Meningie, and went to the local police station. It was Christmas Day. Asked the police station to get an ambulance to take young Bruce, who was 13 months old, to hospital. The police officer said, "Well, it's Christmas Day. There's no way I can do that." So Bruce then went to see a relative of his partner, Thora, because even though they weren't actually legally married, but basically it was a de facto relationship. A relative of Thora, which is Bruce's mother, and she and her husband drove Bruce to Adelaide and went to the Adelaide Children's Hospital. Joe did not accompany them in the car. Now, that was Christmas Day 1957. He was the hospital administration told the relatives that they will contact them and also Bruce's father, Joe, when he was ready to come home. It has to also be remembered this relative did not approve of the way that Bruce was being brought up in a campsite away from the main town, even though, as I said, there was no evidence of any neglect. So from all accounts, it appears that she gave a quite negative view of Joe Trevorrow's parenting of young Bruce. Anyhow, there had been some ads in the local papers in Adelaide around that time, or just prior to that time, asking people to come forward to be foster parents of young Aboriginal children. Bruce was not one of the children they were seeking to have fostered out at the time the ads were put in the paper, but an English immigrant family, English Welsh immigrant family by the surname of Davies, were quite interested in fostering out an Aboriginal child. So they went to the Children's Hospital to have a look. And young Bruce was there, 13 months old, and they said, they asked the nursing staff, what about this baby? And they said, oh yeah, if you want to, you can take that baby home, you can foster that baby out. It has to be remembered at that time, the foster mother, Martha Davies, was not a registered foster carer, and also there'd been no consent or permission given by Bruce's parents. They did not even know. And when Joe had contacted the hospital prior to him being removed, he had asked when was he coming home, and was told, well, he's not quite ready to come home. And also by that time, Bruce's mother, Thora, also knew that he was in hospital and also contacted the hospital and said, oh, he's not ready to come home yet. Well, anyway, the authorities allowed Bruce to be taken by the Davies family, and without the permission or the knowledge of his biological parents. Well, Joe Trevorrow never saw his son again. Joe Trevorrow passed away a few years later and never saw his son again, did not even know where he was. Now, Joe's mother, Thora, had made numerous attempts to reconnect or make contact or find out where he was, had contacted the authorities, and there was a quite important letter, a response from the authorities saying, well, Bruce is not ready to come home yet. When he is, you'll be told. That was months after he'd already been given to the Davies family as a foster child. So the Davies family brought up young Bruce, and I want to make it quite clear that the Davies family were loving people. They brought up Bruce in a reasonable manner, but there were issues. And it appeared that Martha Davies over the years started developing issues that affected her capability of being a parent or foster parent to young Bruce, who was also developing some issues at school, and his behavior, he had some behavioral problems. When he was around 9 years of age, the authorities decided that there could be a reunion between him and his biological mother and his two brothers and sister. That occurred in Adelaide. Then a few months later, it was decided that Bruce, was over summer holidays, could go down and spend some time with his biological mother, which he did. Then he came back to live with the Davies family, and it seemed to unsettle him, and the behavioural issues got worse and worse, and Martha was having trouble coping with that. Then the authorities decided that he should go back to live with his biological mother without actually informing him that was what was happening. He thought he was just going back for another holiday. The Davies didn't know that either. So he didn't have time to actually emotionally prepare for this now separation from his foster family, who he'd been with for 9.5 to nearly 10 years. He went back to live with his biological mother and his Aboriginal family. He found it very difficult, couldn't cope, and that basically led to a number of years of petty crime, and also being in and out of institutions, and he led quite a difficult life until he left school around 15, 16, and then started travelling. And then when he turned 18, he was no longer a ward of the state. His mother passed away while he was away working, so he didn't get to the funeral, but he came back. He then started drifting, travelling throughout southeast of Australia, and also parts of South Australia. Ended up in Victoria, where he met Veronica, who became his wife. They went to live in southeast Victoria, which was her home area, in Bairnsdale, which is near Sale. And they had children as well. Then he was able to obtain jobs. Bruce, even though he was in and out of jobs, he was able to not hold down a job necessarily, but he was able to obtain jobs. But in the early 1990s, he started thinking a little bit more about issues, and he had gone back to South Australia to try at various times to try and connect with his Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal family. Always found it difficult. So he was back and forth between Victoria and South Australia. Then in the early 1990s, or around 1993, it was December 1993, while in Meningie, he actually went to see a lawyer that was working for the Aboriginal Legal Service of South Australia, the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, who said, well, look, you're going to have to go into Adelaide to speak to the head of our civil section. So he went up to Adelaide in December 1993 to see a lawyer by the name of Joanna Richardson, who was working for the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, also the Aboriginal Legal Centre or Service. And then she started, after she came back from summer holidays, she started seeking further documentations, and that basically started the process. And the filing of the Supreme Court action commenced in 1998, the 1st of June 1998. The government at various times tried to have the case knocked out over the pleadings, which is the statement of claim, and also trying to prevent some documents being used and so forth. But the case eventually the trial eventually started in November 2005. By that time, Joanna Richardson had engaged Julian Burnside to be the lead counsel, so Julian Burnside from Victoria, quite a prominent lawyer, a senior counsel, and also Claire O'Connor from the Adelaide Bar, she's quite a prominent barrister in Adelaide today, and always had a reputation of being very feisty and very sharp. So she was junior counsel, and Joanna Richardson was an instructing solicitor. The case commenced on the 10th of November 2005, and it concluded on the 30th of March 2006. It didn't go every single day. It was 30 odd days that over that period of time that the trial went for. Bruce gave evidence in the case, and Justice Gray, he's now retired, Justice Gray was the hearing or the trial judge. He had a history. He was a South Australian born trained lawyer, had gone to a law firm, had then gone to the bar, and then gone to the bench. Was considered to be a very sharp, had a sharp legal mind. There was a lot of expert evidence in the trial, and also there was historical evidence. But the fact was that under the South Australian legal regime at the time of Bruce's separation, for an Aboriginal trial, a child to be removed from their family, you either had to have the consent of the parents, biological parents, or if you didn't have their consent, you had to get a court order to say that the child had to be removed because of neglect or in danger, the child was in danger. Neither of those two things happened. What became quite critical in the legal case, though, was the fact that there was legal opinions or legal advice on file that was written by the State Solicitor or Solicitor General of South Australia, telling the government of the day that it was illegal or unlawful to remove the child, like in Bruce's case, the way that he was removed without the consent of the biological parents or the or court order. So the state could not argue that they did not know what the law was because they had already had legal opinion. That was in the historical documentation that was submitted in the court case, so that was quite strong, as was the letter from the department that was a lie to Bruce's biological mother, saying that he wasn't, the doctors said that he wasn't well enough to come home, because by then he had already been living with his foster parents for at least a couple of months. So they were very important. The other important issue was what was the damage done to Bruce. Now, in 1951, there was a World Health Organization report known as the Balby report, which is about maternal deprivation. So the damage that's done to an infant when you remove them from generally it's the mother. That's why I've called maternal deprivation, but it could have been also from the father if the mother wasn't around. So they were very important issues. Of course, the state defended the action and also had its own expert evidence. And as you know, Adelaide is not a large city, so there was a bit of professional tension between the expert evidence, between various psychologists and so forth, between the state and Bruce's team. Then on the 1st of August 2007, so the trial actually finished on the 30th of March 2006, and there were still some procedural issues that had to be sorted out. But on the 1st of August 2007, Justice Gray handed down his decision. He read out about a 2-page decision in the Supreme Court, and then released later a 500-page judgment, a very comprehensive judgment. Well worth a read, actually. But he came down in favour of Bruce. He basically said that the state had breached its legal obligations, such as fiduciary duty, duty of care, and there had been a misfeasance of public officials. So basically, the government or their officials had acted against the law. And a few other, and also he said there'd been false imprisonment because the removal was unlawful, therefore Bruce has been falsely imprisoned. It's a legal concept, and there was negligence and so forth. And also awarded substantial damages of over $500,000, which included damages, normal damages for the hurt and injury, and also what was called exemplary damages, which are really punitive damages as a form of punishment to the state because they had acted unlawfully, knowing that they were acting unlawfully. The state decided that they were going to appeal the decision, but said that they wouldn't seek the money back or recovery of the compensation. That went on appeal to a full court, and basically the full court upheld the decision of Justice Gray. There were some areas they knocked out, but the substantial issue about Bruce being unlawfully removed or illegally removed from his biological parents still remained, and the compensation that was awarded. And it was the first case in Australian history of a member of the stolen generation successfully suing the state, and it remains the only case that's been successful. Now, I thought what would be interesting is that, well, before I read some parts of the judgment and some of the exchange in court, the decision came down on the 1st of August 2007. Then in 2007, late 2007, the Kevin Rudd Labor opposition won government. And then the first day of the new parliament, well, as Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, on the 13th of February 2008, Kevin Rudd did the apology to the stolen generations. Bruce was in Parliament. He was in invited guests in the gallery. And then he passed away on the 20th of June 2008 at 51 years of age. So he passed away less than 1 year after the judgment. Bruce had issues with alcohol, had been a very heavy smoker, so his health had not been in great shape, and he passed away at 51 years of age. Now, if I just turn to part of the judgment, so Justice Gray, in reading out this 2-page, 2 or 3 page, actually I think it was a bit more, might have been 4 or 5 pages. Anyway, but the judgment itself is over 500 pages, said that the Crown solicitors of the time gave advice that the powers to remove Aboriginal children from their parents were limited. It is significant that at relevant times, the state, through its cabinet, was aware of these advices and the request for legislative change to provide the authority to remove Aboriginal children from their natural families in an unrestricted manner. Given the serious evasion of private rights associated with such removals, it is not surprising that the government was slow to move, and in fact, in the event was not prepared to provide any such broad legal authority. The relevant advices about legal authority were made known to the Aboriginal Protection Board and through its secretary to the department. I am satisfied that the conduct of the state amounted to a misfeasance in public office, together with the false imprisonment of the plaintiff, had been a material cause of the plaintiff's long-term depression. It was this conduct that ruptured the bond between the plaintiff and his mother and natural family. The breaches of duty of care that occurred were also a material cause of his depression and other losses. Those losses included the loss of his Aboriginal identity. Although there may have been other contributing causes, the conduct of the state was a material contributing cause. In the result, the state is liable to the plaintiff in respect of misfeasance in public office, false imprisonment, and breaches of duty of care, both in regards to his removal, placement, and return. The misfeasance in public office and false imprisonment occurred in circumstances where the state acted deliberately and unlawfully, and in circumstances where it was reasonably foreseeable that there was a risk of harm. Now, Justice Gray said, it talked about the damage caused by his removal, his placement, and his return. And that was the other critical issue, that when he was returned to his biological family, there was no preparation for it. There was no preparing him to leave his foster mother, even though there'd been issues between his foster mother and him. She did love him and he loved her. So that was an issue. And then he wasn't, the Aboriginal culture and his Aboriginal family was pretty foreign to him, and there was no preparation for that. So that was like the kernel, the basis to the decision itself. Now, in regards to Bruce's relationship with his wife, Veronica, and the children. So Justice Burnside is questioning Trevorrow in the trial. And he says to Bruce, so he's asking Bruce a question. Does he feel close to his wife, Veronica? Do you feel close to her or not? No. Do you feel close to your children? No. Do you feel close to anyone? No. Are you able to tell His Honour what you are like as a father to your children? I feel that I can't be a father to my children because I haven't got the skills. And then a bit later, what sort of things do you do with them or have you done with them in the past as a father? Have you taken them on holidays or picnics? No. Did you ever play with them when they were little kids? No. Have you ever hugged them or cuddled them when they were little kids? No. Why? Just haven't felt close. So that was he had real problems trying to show any emotional affection to his children and even to his wife. Now, in regards to his biological siblings, so he was the youngest, so there was two brothers, Tom and George, and there also was a sister called Hilda. Now, interestingly, which is also important in the judgment, Hilda, George and Tom, although they had some issues leading into adulthood, they all ended up being quite successful Aboriginal leaders and cultural educators. And I think, I'm not sure whether it was Tom or George now, even lectured overseas, or even at Harvard at one stage. So they had, because they had stayed together, had been with their biological parents in the Aboriginal culture, they felt comfortable in their Aboriginal culture. And so they, in a way, which was the other important part of the case, they were like a control group. They weren't removed, stayed with their parents, lived in an Aboriginal cultural setting, were successful. Bruce removed, didn't feel at ease in the white world or the European world or the Aboriginal world. I should say that, as I said before, Joe, which was their father, biological father, had passed away before Bruce had gone back to live with his biological father. Also, Veronica had left Joe in any case, and she and her new partner, or new husband, he was quite violent at times to the children, and also to Thora. So it was really Thora as the mother that brought up the kids. But anyway, in regards to the siblings, so they also were witnesses in the case. So in regards to George, so he's on the witness stand, and let me just see. Okay, how do you get on with him? So he's talking about Bruce. Okay, let me go back. So Bruce resumes Burnside resumes his questioning, and he's talking now to George, which is Bruce's brother. Since you turned your life around, or rather got more serious about things, have you had much contact with Bruce? No, still not a lot of time with Bruce. He comes over sometimes, but very rarely. How do you get on with him when he comes over? We talk, but it's not the same. You haven't got much to talk about. It's been very difficult over the years, even when he has been home. The biggest problem has been when he's at the family table and it might be Christmas and you start talking about what you did years ago. So you're always watching your mouth when you have got him around, because you realise sometimes when you open your mouth that he wasn't there and you might be talking about important times. So it's hard to have a lot of discussion when he's around because you feel like you're hurting him. Justice Gray interrupts. What would you call an important time? This is now George speaking again. It should have been the time when there was a major birthday or death or something like that. And, he wasn't in attendance for something important. Okay, so then when Tom took the stand, he was being examined by Claire O'Connor, which was the junior counsel for Bruce. So when they returned, so they'd had a break, O'Connor questions Tom about some of his own shortcomings and as a young man in his brushes with the law. Tom also explains that with marriage and a strong, loyal wife's encouragement, he gave up drinking at age 23 and settled down to be a good father and successful citizen. Underpinning all this was the significance of family when learning to cope with life vicissitudes. Now O'Connor wants to talk about Bruce. She asked Tom about the first time Bruce visited them. And this is Tom speaking now. I remember when Mum brought Bruce home to Victor Harbour for a short while. I think it was a holiday period. We knew who Bruce was and he was our brother, but it took some getting used to. You know what I mean? Because he was quiet, very quiet. Do you remember him coming back to live? He was different. He wasn't there with us all the time. So therefore he missed out on how could I say, our way of life. Because he was raised up differently and we had to be aware sometimes when we talk and we talk in our language and we talk about somebody or we talk about something that Bruce wasn't familiar with, that we were talking about even sometimes our actions and what we do with our body language, our cultural ways. Bruce wasn't aware of that type of thing. So you can see by Bruce being in the stand and his siblings, how the story that was developed for his case was that he was removed unlawfully in the legal sense. There was no preparation for his return to his biological family. That as a result of that, he never felt really attached to his Aboriginal culture. That caused problems in his own adulthood. He had problems connecting with his own children, and he was a very damaged individual. And as I said, he passed away sadly at age 51, less than a year after a successful case. So look, I'll leave it at that at the moment, and if there's any questions for me to answer.
Thanks, Tony. That was great. So interesting to hear about this. We do have one question here from Helen. I think you may have answered it, but you may be able to expand on it. She wanted to know if there was any other cases like this one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, let me give you a little, in answering this question, I'll let you give you a little bit of history on the cases in Australia. On this, there was a case called the Williams case in New South Wales in the early 90s, started in the early 1990s, finished in about 1998. That was a common law case too, based on negligence and fiduciary duty in regards to the removal of one Aboriginal woman from her family, but it was unsuccessful. Then there was a constitutional high court case from the Northern Territory. That was also unsuccessful. Then there was a case based on common law principles of negligence and so forth, the Kabila case. The High Court case was the Kruger case. The federal court case was the Kabila case. That was also unsuccessful. And the more in 2005, 2006, no, actually later, there was also a case in WA called the Collard case, unsuccessful. So there's been cases that have had elements of this case, but there's been no case in Australian history where you had the fact scenario here. I mean, Bruce could not have been a more perfect litigant or a more perfect plaintiff, because the reason that is that you have documentary evidence that shows that the state had legal advice on the legality of what they were doing. You then also have a control group, which are his siblings that weren't removed. Because see, one of the problems, even if he had been successful, was, well, what the damage, what were the causes of his damage? Was it due to other things? Well, yeah, always there's other things involved, but the fact was you had a stark contrast here between siblings that were not removed and Bruce. Siblings that had their own issues, but were able to overcome that and had a strong connection to their culture. Bruce, who had been removed, was not able to overcome that and was a very damaged individual. So no, there had not really been a case like this, but there had been other cases.
Great. Amy wants to know, did you meet Bruce or did you do this research through case records?
Well, unfortunately, no, I didn't meet Bruce. Interestingly, I should tell you a bit about, I actually only really knew about this case on the day of the decision. So the decision was handed out 1st of August 2007, and it generated worldwide interest. And I would have heard it the next morning on ABC radio. I thought, gee, that's interesting. So, as I said, then I read the judgment and I wrote a legal article on it. When it then came to the issue of thinking about doing the book on it, I actually flew over to South Australia to go to the appeal, the appeal of the decision. But of course, Bruce had passed away. Bruce had passed away within a year of the decision being handed down. So I did not see Bruce. I did conduct interview with his 3 siblings. I conducted interviews with his wife in Victoria, the judge, Justice Burnside, Claire O'Connor, and also Martha Davies, the foster mother's daughter. Now, I tried to interview also the barristers and solicitors for the state, but the state would not allow them to be interviewed, which was a bit silly because the case had all been over, was all over, but anyway, they didn't allow me. So I had done some interviews, and then I based it also on the document, on the decision, and also the court submissions and the court documents, and also the transcript of the trial, which ran for over 3,000 pages. So I think it was about 3,025 pages of the transcript of the trial, which I read. Now, there will always be people that will question parts of anything, and I base this predominantly on the court case. Obviously, the early bits of his life, you fill in a few things here and there. But yeah, so it's based basically heavily on the court transcript and the accompanying court documentation, and of course, some of the interviews.
It's a huge document to read through. Were you denied any other information or files when researching the book?
No, I wasn't denied any of the files. I wasn't able to obtain the witness statement. Yeah. So usually when you go to a lawyer, the lawyer takes down what they call a statement of evidence. So I wasn't able to obtain that. I just wasn't able to get it for whatever reason from that wasn't necessarily that wasn't submitted to the court. That was actually written by Joanna Richardson, but it just wasn't available. I also, of course, interviewed Joanna Richardson, who was the actual lawyer that started the case way back in, as I said, back in the 90s. So she was the one that started the case. So no, I wasn't really denied any. The Justice Gray was fantastic because he gave me access to the court transcript and the documents, and also I was able to obtain the court documents from Justice Burnside. I'm not Justice Burnside, Julian Burnside.
Great. And is the 500-page judgment that you spoke about, is that available for the public to read? Oh,
yeah, it's reported. It's a public judgment. You can actually get it online, I imagine. If you go onto OSLI Legal Service, which is a legal information service online, and put in South Australian Supreme Court and go back to 2005, 2007, you should be able to obtain it. Yeah, no, it's a public document. And it might even be in hard form, I'm not sure.
Great. Someone else has asked, did the Bringing Them Home report recommend reparation? Was there any of that carried out?
Yeah. Okay. I should also say in the Bringing Them Home report, that also obviously went to South Australia, did interviews, and it actually went down to the Kuyon, is that the Kuyon region? Is that how you say it? What's that region? Is that the Meningie region? Is that the
Coorong?
Coorong region. It also went down to there, to that area. And that's where I actually went down to interview Bruce's siblings. Bringing Them Home did recommend compensation or reparations. That was one of the sticking points. So the Howard government basically the two major sticking points, or three main sticking points or criticisms they had of the report, was the recommendations of reparations or compensation, the request or recommendation for an apology, an official apology, and also the finding that what had happened was genocide. Now, that was a very politically charged term to use, and in hindsight, maybe it might have been best not to use that term. But anyway, it was. So yeah, compensation was recommended. Now, the Commonwealth has never agreed to it. Tasmania set up its own scheme. After the Bruce Trevorrow case, the state obviously was worried there might be a flood of other cases, which hasn't eventuated. But South Australia set up its own reparation scheme. It's a modest scheme, but there is one there, and a few of the other states have also have similar compensation schemes.
Great. And how long did it take to research and write the book?
Okay, well, that's interesting because when I commenced doing it, I was an academic, full-time legal academic. When I concluded it, I was a politician or parliamentarian. So what the problem was, I commenced this situation in 2008. So the judgment was 2007. I started writing the Law Journal article in 2008, and I got elected to Parliament in 2010. Now that put a major barrier in front of me trying to do this book. And obviously, being a parliamentarian is a very different life than being an academic. So there was a few years of hiatus. So from woe to go, it took me 10 years. Not that I worked on it every day. It would have been done in a few years if I had done that. But you can imagine reading over 3,000 pages of court transcript, looking at court documents and so forth. It would take a long time. It was one of the hardest things I've done. And I did at times feel that I wouldn't be able to achieve it or I should give up. But I never really seriously thought of giving up because I thought I had an onus on the people I had interviewed to go ahead with it. And I thought it was important to get this story out to the general public. Because I think that's, in Australia, we don't do this. We don't do this issue of reporting legal cases in a more accessible manner to the general public. And that was my motivation, was to not get over legal, not to become over legalized in the book. I think you don't have to be a lawyer to be able to read the book. But yeah, 10 years in all.
Wow, that's a long time. And we're glad you didn't give up, so that's good. And are there, last question, what other books have you written and are you working on anything at the moment?
Okay, so my first, I've done some co-author books on sports and law, but we'll leave that aside. But the ones I've done on solo, my first one was from my PhD, which was called Separated, which is on stolen generations. Actually, in the court transcript, some of my work is referred to, although it wasn't actually reported in the final judgment. So that was on guardianship law and stolen generation. Then I wrote a book on Sir Ronald Wilson, who was Western Australia's first Supreme High Court judge, but also was the lead commissioner on bringing them home. So I wrote a biography on him that came out in 2007, which actually won West Australian Premier's Book Prize. Then I did a book on the Mickelbergs. The Mickelbergs are brothers in West Australia that were charged and convicted of stealing gold from the Perth Mint. Anyway, they pleaded their innocence. They served 10 odd years or around that in jail. Then anyway, they're finally exonerated. So I wrote a book on that. And then I wrote this book. And since this book, I've written two other manuscripts, one on a union, a history of the West Australian branch of the Maritime Union of Australia. And I've also written a manuscript on, basically my daughter has special needs. She's 27 now. So I've written a book about her, and I've used that as a vehicle to talk about issues in regards to disabilities. So they're the two ones that manuscripts that I've completed, which I hope to find publishers for. And I'm halfway through a book at the moment on euthanasia or voluntary assisted dying, because it was legislated. It was passed in the WA Parliament last year.
Wow, so you're very, very busy. We
Yeah.
hope you do find publishers for those three, and you can
Yeah.
certainly come back and join us and talk about them when you have.
Thank
So
you.
there's no more questions this evening, Tony, so I don't know if there's anything else you want to share with us before we leave tonight.
I know. Look, just thank you very much for having interest in this. I did actually come over to the Adelaide Writers Festival early in the year, which pre-COVID, well, COVID was around, but obviously we didn't have as the severity or the travel restrictions that we do now. And I always had an ambition to get to the Adelaide Writers Festival, so it was fantastic. Look, all I can say, if I do write those other books, or if those other books are published, I'll let you know. I do have a soft spot for South Australia. I do think it's a great spot, and thank you very much once again for showing interest.
That's okay, our pleasure. And thank you for joining us all the way from WA and fitting us into your busy schedule, and for sharing Bruce's moving story with us. And Bruce has certainly left a lasting legacy and deserves to be commended for pursuing justice where justice was denied for so long. So congratulations on a great book. And Tony's book can be purchased online directly from the publisher at sorry, I only did two W's then, didn't I? www.fremantlepress.com.au. And please keep following the Marion Library's Facebook page, the City of Marion website, and check your inbox to be kept up to date on all of the upcoming Library Through the Lens presentations and workshops. And if you haven't already registered, on the 10th of September, this is for us Adelaideans, we welcome special guest author Victoria Perman to the Marion Cultural Centre Theatre. That's our first face-to-face author event since COVID hit us a few months back, so we hope you will join us then. Thank you again, Tony, and thank you for joining us, and good night.
No, thank you.